Okay, hi everyone. Imogen and I are back for another one of our chats, and today we're going to be talking about ankle and foot mobility. So, welcome to Imogen, first of all.
Hiya.
Hiya. So we've talked a lot about, we've done kind of shoulder mobility, we've talked about hip mobility and knee mobility, and kind of, functional movements and things in general. We're kind of working our way down the body, and now we have arrived at ankle and foot mobility, which for both of us actually, in terms of our own experience of that in recent times, which I'm sure we'll have a little talk about as part of this, but also the types of clients that we work with regularly. Although we don't have, I wouldn't say kind of ankle and foot injuries are kind of our main things that we come across all the time with our clients. It's not as common as some of the knee injuries and things that we work with people on. But in terms of ankle mobility in particular, we do find that it tends to be sometimes actually the root cause of some of those other issues, like with knee injuries that people have when they have poor ankle mobility. So we're going to talk a little bit about injuries and about how you can perhaps improve ankle and foot mobility and the kind of things that we do to work with people in that area. So both of us in recent times, kind of around Christmas time, wasn't it? We both kind of had a bit of an ankle injury ourselves. You were a little bit worse for wear than I was, a bit more minor. But we were saying that actual, ankle and foot injuries, although they might seem like they're not going to last for too long if you're going, if you're not broken a bone, but actually they seem to take longer than other areas to heal, don't they?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, we were talking about it, weren't we, the other day, of the fact that we catch still now, we're what, like 2-3 months on, and although like I think we're both back to doing what we normally do, our normal routines and stuff, but there is still points where if we do something, move in certain ways, that we still notice, and it's just a little reminder that it's still not 100%. Like I think
Yeah.
you were sort of saying it was with the plantar flexion, wasn't it? The pointing
That's
toe,
right,
sort
yeah.
of catching certain movements there. Whereas for me, it's not so much in that range, but I still catch it if I go into more of like the inversion. So sitting cross-legged, if I have the weight loaded onto so it was my right foot, I kept the same. I can do it, it's fine. It's much more comfortable than it was like once upon a time I couldn't do it at all. But I still now, if it's particularly if I've not moved much, so when it's a bit more sort of sedentary or stiff and it hasn't mobilized much, that's when it will kind of be like, ooh, hello,
Yeah.
I'm still here. And it's not painful, it is just that sort of kind of like an achy sensation, I guess is the best
Yeah.
way to describe
Navel,
it,
a bit
that
of
sort
a
of like
twinge, isn't it? Yeah.
twinge, that pull of like,
Yeah.
oh hello, I'm here. But
Yeah.
I don't know about you, just a couple of movements, either sort of like a rotational movement and stuff like this, and I'm fine, mine will ease off and it will be fine. So
Yeah. And I
it is
think,
just those little bits that just kind of
yeah, I was going to say, I think, with the foot, in comparison to other areas, particularly knee, as say hip, the foot tends to, and the ankle tends to involve a lot less, obviously, muscles. You haven't got anywhere near the range of muscles that you have surrounding the other joints that we've talked about before. And the majority of the issues is with ligaments and tendons. And we have a lot more of those, obviously, around the ankle in the foot area. And ligaments do take just so much longer to repair, compared to obviously just kind of a bit of a tendon strain or even muscle strains or tears. It is that longer process, unfortunately. And so, like you say, these little twinges that we sometimes get even months down the line, they're a little reminder sometimes that actually we need to continue to do good ankle mobility work and obviously strengthening. So it's that mixture, isn't it, of strengthening around that area, and making sure it's really as mobile as possible, and you can keep moving it. Again, we use this phrase a lot, that diversity of movement. When we talk about You know, you were saying about, you know, the foot can move in so many ways, can't it? You know, you've got plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, you've got the inversion. You know, it can rotate as well. So you know, you want to be able to kind of move in a variety of ways as well, which is important. Now, for me personally, in terms of the clients that I see that I'm often advising in terms of ankle mobility and foot mobility in general, tends to be with athletes. It could be lifters in the gym, or it could be sports people such as, yes, runners and cyclists and things like that, but also footballers, for example, where, you know, obviously they're using their feet a lot. They need really good ankle mobility. They need to strengthen around that area. And with the lifters, it would also be improving ankle mobility to improve technique on lifting skills. So such as, obviously, you know, you can get a deeper squat, the better your ankle mobility is. Same with kind of deadlifts can improve technique when you've got better ankle mobility. So I do kind of, when I'm doing training programs for people, whether it's kind of like a prehab or a rehab one, you know, I will always be including plenty of mobility as well as strengthening work in that area. To obviously sometimes because it is good for rehab, but also reducing that risk of injury as you go along. Now, obviously, particularly with footballers, they are doing a lot of quick movements as well. So quick turns, and, you know, they're turning on their heels all the time. They have to go into sudden sprints sometimes. So it is those unstable, you know, movements that they kind of have to do, and you need to make sure that you're trying to prevent injury as much as possible by strengthening that whole area. And the better, obviously, the mobility is, the ankle mobility, the less likely it is that we're gonna, you know, damage some ligaments or tendons in that area. So, you know, I do work on that with those clients, and I do things such as banded joint mobilizations for restoring natural movement of the ankle joint, using things like the posterior and downward pull of the talus that's in the ankle to actually mobilize like the correct movement that the ankle should be doing. Because sometimes those people who have poor ankle mobility have a bit of it's like having a restriction. So I often describe it as kind of like you're driving down a straight road and then you come across a bit of a roadblock, a restriction, and what you end up doing is to continue moving, particularly with people doing squats and things like that, you kind of have to go around the roadblock to continue that journey downwards. Now, what people tend to do sometimes is that lack of ankle mobility and having to avoid that restriction wherever they get to, whatever, you know, they're in terms of how far they can kind of push those ankles. We tend to do things like compromise knees. So, you know, knees will then kind of move, obviously, on an internal rotation sometimes to help with stabilization, or they might go too external and then cause issues that go all the way up the kinetic chain to the hip, and then they have kind of hip impingements and things like that. And we end up making all sorts of compromises, and we think it's a knee issue or a hip issue because that's where we start to get the pain, when we've kind of got that imbalance then. But actually, when it comes down to it, the reason why that's happening in the first place is because they're compensating in those other areas because of the lack of mobility through their ankles. So actually that tends to be, when I'm looking and assessing people, particularly for knee and hip pain, whether it's through lifting or whatever reason, I'm always looking at ankle mobility as well, just in case that is one of those things which is, you know, they've changed their movement pattern because of that restriction, which I think a lot of people are very surprised at when I do the ankle mobility testing with people, that actually could be part of the root cause of their pain. So, you know, it's always thinking about that whole kinetic chain and what your ankle mobility can actually affect all the way up. So those are the kind of things that I tend to work on the most when it comes to ankle and foot health and mobility and strengthening. Obviously, there's all sorts of strengthening exercises that we can do in that area that involve sometimes using the calf muscle as well, strengthening that. But we also kind of had a chat earlier about kind of calf and stretching and things like that, didn't we,
Yeah.
in relation to the ankle mobility. And actually, depending on what type of an athlete you are, we were saying that runners tend to be pretty good at doing things like stretching out calves. So actually, doing too much stretching and overstretching can be a bit, can be actually detrimental to them, and we can overdo it. Whereas actually some other people, again, it could be kind of particularly gym goers, for example, doing strength training, wouldn't necessarily think to stretch out their calves too much, and they can get particularly tight. And that's where you might also get things like, Achilles tears because they are too tight, they haven't stretched out, and that ligament is just taking on, and the tendon, they're just taking on too much in that area. So that tendon is just kind of, getting to breaking point, as it were, because you haven't done perhaps enough stretching through the calf. So it's a fine balance with calf stretching, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, like you say, it kind of depends on what you're doing, and like what the demands of the activity or that you're taking part in is requiring. Because like you say, things like football and the strength, you need the mobility in order to either change the positions quickly, or you need it in order to get into correct positions to be efficient. Whereas, like I say, I often find with the ankle issues and things like this, it often tends to be runners that I tend to work with. And for running, generally, you actually, like we said, they tend to be better with the mobility because they know they need to stretch, it's drilled into it. But actually, because of the way that you're sort of having to push off and propel from the floor, you need the resistance there to push against. So actually, for runners, it's not so much about the mobility, like you do need some, but actually it's the more of the strength side of stuff, so that you've got that resistance there, a bit more of sort of a tone to be able to push and propel against. So that's one I often tend to find. So like if it's not a mobility issue, one of the things with the testing sort of ankle stuff that I'll look at is a bit with banded type, again with banded work, but against going against the eccentric contraction. So you're trying to control the movement of the return, and if you're doing it slowly, what you're looking for is a nice smooth movement. Can't see my hand. Nice smooth movement in whatever direction you're going. Whereas if you tend to notice, what you tend to notice if it is sort of slightly reduced sort of strength, and I tend to prefer the word control rather than strength, because particularly talking around the ankle and stuff, generally we're looking at like calf muscles and things like this, and they're actually quite strong muscles. So I tend to prefer control because it explains it better. But what you generally find is you'll see that sort of like juddery type movements, where you might find there'll be ranges where you can go quite smooth, but then like you say, there'll be those roadblocks where you suddenly kind of struggle, and it either you speed up, it'll start to move in a sort of other muscle, or you might feel it further up, like other quad and things like this start to engage in order to help control. And so I find that they're quite useful, because the testing movement you can then do as exercises and stuff to help strengthen. The other bit that I think we probably will touch upon with it is obviously then like moving down the foot as well, particularly for sort of when you're looking at like running and stuff like this, is then you're looking at the mobility in the feet. So quite often one will be the big toe of looking at how mobile that is, because you need it to push on that end phase. But it quite often will either be, if you lose that sort of mobility there, then it will alter how your foot positioning is hitting the ground, as well as then what forces are having to go through other muscle groups. And again, it will put the strain through the sort of the calves and stuff like that, which I generally find are the ones that tend to take the brunt of it, mainly because I think they're the biggest group in there, for sort of like they're sort of involved in a lot of like the control and side of stuff as well. Otherwise, there's the one that's more looking at more like your tib post, so your tib posterior. That's the other one that I tend to find is useful when you're looking at like control and strength, just purely because it's the only one that's working the whole way through the walking stance. So you kind of need to be able to target, and that one, if you're doing like the cheats like you mentioned, where you sort of hit those roadblocks and either letting the knees drop in or out, it generally is that one that then I find is also then struggling, because it's the one that's trying to keep that heel in the sort of neutral position.
And I think that's interesting actually. You kind of when we were talking about control and stability and things like that, one of the other things which is just an absolute fundamental that I go through with clients when it comes to often any of the hip, knee, again, ankle issues or building strength in other weaker areas, is stability of the foot, starting from the ground up. Again, that whole kinetic chain where that stabilization of the movements of knee, hip, etc., all starts. And what I try to get people to do is really channel their foot, think about their foot placement, and kind of thinking about what we would describe on the bottom of the foot, you know, the kind of the tripod or the triangle shape where you've got 3 points of contact that ideally you want, either if you're training, let's say, again, kind of gym-based training, you know, if you're training ideally in kind of socks or kind of some sort of thinner sole, barefoot type shoes, just to get really good contact with the ground. 3 points of contact, which would be the little pad that's underneath your big toe, so that area there. Again, similarly on the other side, just beneath your kind of 4th and 5th toe there, and then obviously your heel. So creating that triangle kind of tripod, having those 3 points of contact kind of, you know, jammed into the ground as such, making sure that the heel's not lifting as well. And then also thinking about the center of that tripod or triangle being like your center of gravity. So trying to, whatever exercise you're doing in particular, or even movement that you're doing, trying to get the majority of your weight over that center of gravity for maximum stability. And then the other thing, of course, that you can do is try and really jam your big toe kind of into the floor. And then, you know, again, ideally, if it is a kind of training base rather than out running and things like that, thinking about using your kind of toes to grip with, just like we use our hands to kind of pick things up, and, you know, use that as another way to kind of stabilize, as well as making sure that heel is rooted to the ground as well, just for max stability. Because what I find, again, when I'm looking at people training, so people trying to do, you know, weighted squats or deadlifts and things like that, particularly with squats, is if I can see their foot, and I can either see the heel kind of lifting as they come down, or they're kind of pronating or supinating one way or the other with their foot, and they've got rolling of the foot going on, they're just really decreasing the stability of their whole entire kind of technique of that squat, or whatever it might be, deadlift, for example, as well. Anything like that, even the single leg stuff like Bulgarian split squats as well, lunges, you know, you're going to be so much more off balance, and you're really actually going to decrease not only the stability of your move, but then obviously that impacts, you know, your training. You can't continue to go heavier and heavier and heavier and be stable with that additional weight if you are not thinking about the stability of that foot on the floor. So that is one thing which I kind of, you know, if you come to me, you know that I'm going to be talking to you about foot placement and foot stability from the ground up, even if you're having hip issues, you know. So I think that's important.
It's important because I mean, like, it's not, it translates across the board. So even if you're not one to do sort of the training in the gym, like you're sort of like with the movements that you're mentioning, it's useful for if you're sort of more interested in your yoga. So there's like the balancing pose, because you've still got that balance element. Yeah. So you still need that contact with the ground. And even if it's then translating more into sort of like exercise specifically targeting foot and ankle, it's certainly that sort of cueing is one that I will give for the calf raises, because that, like, anyone with calf issues will know that that's a go-to exercise. But it's like the cueing with the 3 points is your starting point. And then obviously as you're lifting, like the heel will move in that movement, but that's then when you're then focusing on the 2 front points. And if you're concentrating on keeping those 2 points in contact, like you say, it will then help keep that heel stable. So then you're not rocking one way or the other. And then you're going to make sure that you're getting the most from that exercise. So that sort of cueing, like you say, that triangle and engaging the foot is so important for quite a lot of different movements.
Yeah, it's such a fundamental basic. And although I call it a fundamental basic, you know, it's surprising how many people don't give a second thought to something like that when they're experiencing kind of joint-based, you know, lower body joint-based issues. So yeah, it's always one of my kind of first starting points on an injury assessment, or just a kind of strength training assessment in terms of technique fixes. That is, you know, something that is just absolutely key, I think. So yeah, definitely kind of, if you're someone who hasn't thought about that too much before, to see what difference difference it makes to you when you start thinking about those 3 points of contact and using better kind of foot placement for stability, even if you're kind of experiencing hip issues as well. It goes all the way
and
up.
just like you say, just try it with standing, just standing, so it was two-footed and stuff.
Exactly,
and notice I often get people to do it like eyes closed and march, and then just see how they're standing naturally, and then if they're not aware of those sort of points of contact, think about it, and then you automatically feel the chain all the way up that kinetic chain. It's quite surprising.
It is. No, it's a good one. So hopefully people can take away that as a big tip from today's chat, all about ankle and foot mobility. Obviously, again, there's so many things that we could talk about in this area, particularly, you know, with the types of exercises you can do. But obviously, as always, if people do have additional questions or you want to get in touch about something specific, you can always get in touch via our socials or send us an email, and we'll be happy to advise you. Right, another one in the bag. We've covered all the way down to feet and ankle joint mobility this time, so we'll perhaps look at doing a slightly different topic on the next chat. But great to see you again, Imogen. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
See you again soon. Thanks, guys. Bye.